Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe, and share. The records place us in Westchester County, 1879, a district where polished estates overlooked the river, and where the accumulation of American wealth presented itself in marble porticos and solemn gardens. At the heart of this landscape stood the Fairchild residence, a great house of stone and iron, built by a family whose fortune came not from invention nor enterprise, but from its clever entanglement with investors and shipping magnates. It is within these halls that the story begins, not with triumph, but with a death that unsettled every ledger and every silence in the Fairchild line, the death of Theodore Fairchild. On the evening of November 3rd, servants reported hearing muffled coughing from Mr. Theodore Fairchild's study. When the door was opened at dawn, his body was discovered slumped across an open account book. His lips were tinged with the grayish hue of suffocation, though no struggle was evident. The attending physician, one Dr. Peeville Henley, signed the certificate without hesitation, apoplexy brought on by exhaustion. Yet the accounts of the household whispered otherwise. One maid testified in a parish note, later redacted, that she smelt a bitter vapor sharp as ether. A gardener recalled that the windows had been nailed shut for the season. Eleanor herself, young widow now scarcely 30, swore that Theodore had never before suffered a seizure, nor shown the frailty that might justify so sudden an end. A marginal note in the hand of Reverend Callahan, who recorded the burial, reads, "There are deaths that proceed by nature, and deaths that proceed by arrangement. This one I cannot place." Eleanor's solitude. The widow Eleanor Fairchild remained behind in the house, surrounded not by comfort but by the smothering weight of scrutiny. In society papers she was portrayed as the grieving ornament of a fortune, photographed in her veil, her pale hand resting upon the carved arm of a chair. But within her home, a different story spread. Murmurs of instability, of a widow undone by grief, of letters written in an unsteady hand. Theodore's business partners were quick to appear in the drawing room, offering condolences edged with calculation. Harrison Kensington, the shipping philanthropist, Marcus Cromwell, whose fleets had made him indispensable in wartime contracts, and James Wright, textile magnate, all came bearing words of sympathy, and all departed with fragments of the Fairchild papers under their arm. Among the fragments were Theodore's ledgers, the same that his widow had hoped to examine. Eleanor noticed the absences, though she did not yet know their weight. Objects of unease. It is recorded that Eleanor began to collect and preserve small traces of her husband's final days. In a locked drawer she kept the quill pen, broken at the nib, stained faintly with ink and something darker, a pocket diary, its last page torn cleanly, as if excised, a brass key found in Theodore's coat which fit no lock in the Fairchild residence. These artifacts entered later into an inventory catalogue, property of the Westchester Parish Archive, now stamped missing, 1902, formed the kernel of her suspicions. Medical speculation. Dr. Henley meanwhile began to speak openly of Eleanor's condition. In correspondence preserved in the Journal of Nervous Disorders, Volume 4, 1880, he referred obliquely to a notable case of hysteria in a young widow of means, whose imagination supplied conspiracies where only business misfortune lay. Thus began the long process of discrediting her. Every question she posed was catalogued as a symptom, every sleepless night a mark of degeneration, and though she sensed the cruelty in this reduction, she had not yet grasped the machinery arrayed against her. Marginal notes. Fragments survive. On the back leaf of an account book burnt along one edge, salvaged from the estate sale decades later, appears Eleanor's handwriting. "They say it was apoplexy. I smelt the ether. I heard the latch draw. He was not alone in that room. I must keep record, lest I too be erased." The note is unsigned, but the hand is hers. Shadows of what was to come. In those first weeks of mourning, the widow still possessed her agency. She walked the corridors, oversaw the servants, wrote letters to distant relations, yet attention seeped into every exchange. The sudden politeness of neighbors, the murmured consultations between physicians, the glances of lawyers who seemed to await her collapse. Already, her name was being prepared for history, not as a woman of reason, but as a case study. Already, her questions about her husband's ledgers and partners were being marked down as evidence of paranoia. The house grew cold with these unspoken judgments. Tonight we continue the Fairchild mystery, a widow surrounded not by comfort but by whispers and vultures in velvet gloves, a story buried beneath charity, philanthropy, and the polite corruption of America's Gilded Age. If you have not yet subscribed, now is the time, for what follows may never be written again. The Ledger Unearthed. In the weeks following Theodore Fairchild's burial, Eleanor roamed the empty halls like a restless archivist, her mourning dress dragged against the wood floors carrying dust into rooms long servants avoided her gaze, for the house was no longer a place of routine, but of suspicion. Behind the false back of a cabinet, an imperfection she had always known but never thought to test, she discovered what remained of her husband's private ledger, bound in cracked leather and stiffened with age. The books detailed not just the profits of the Fairchild estate, but transactions far more sinister. Entries marked with unfamiliar initials recorded shipments arriving at midnight, cash delivered in untraceable sums, and payments to men whose names appeared later in the annals of Westchester. Criminal cases. The initials appeared frequently, beside tallies that suggested not philanthropy, but bribery. MC followed them, tied to maritime shipments never taxed, nor declared, and then JW linked to textile consignments stained with rumors of child labor and fires conveniently forgot. Eleanor pressed her palm against the page, as though to steady herself. These were not the innocent records of commerce. They were maps of conspiracy. The visitors. No sooner had she begun to piece together the meaning than her solitude was interrupted. Each week one of Theodore's former associates would call. Their condolences rang hollow, their smiles practiced. Harrison Kensington, his cane tapping against the marble, assured Eleanor that the estate would be safely managed if she would simply sign the proper paper. His eyes lingered on her with a calculated sympathy, as though he were measuring not her grief, but her pliability. Marcus Cromwell, with his sea-weathered voice, warned of debts her husband had concealed, debts that could ruin her if not settled with discretion. He carried the salt of Atlantic trade in his clothes, but Eleanor sensed only the rot of corruption in his breath. James Wright, quieter, colder, said little. His contribution was silence, the kind that presses upon a room until all words feel dangerous. Each visit ended the same way, a subtle pressure to surrender documents, ledgers, or authority. Each time Eleanor declined, politely at first, then with the tightening resolve of a woman beginning to understand that she was less widow than quarry. Isolation as medicine. Dr. Henley returned often, under the guise of care. He would sit across from Eleanor in the drawing room, his spectacles glinting in the dim light, his notebook open. He asked questions not of her health, but of her thoughts. Did she feel unsafe in the house? Had she experienced visions, impressions of Theodore's ghost? Did the ledgers trouble her dreams? When she admitted to restlessness, he wrote symptoms of nervous collapse. When she described her suspicions, he wrote delusional paranoia. He prescribed tonics that left her dizzy, powders that stilled her limbs, and above all rest. Rest, in the language of the age, meant withdrawal from letters, from visits, from society. It was a polite word for confinement. A growing unease, in the margins of the ledgers, she now hid beneath her bed. Eleanor began to record her own notes, part diary, part warning. One fragment, found decades later, reads, "They call it grief, but I see the pattern. Theodore's death was the first stitch in a larger design. They will make me the second. My words, they say, are illness, but words are all I have left." Outside her window carriages came and went. Servants whispered of new instructions, of lawyers preparing documents. The estate, like a body already in rigor, was being divided piece by piece, while its mistress was quietly being labeled mad. The gathering storm, every corner of Eleanor's world seemed designed to undermine her. Friends who once called daily now avoided her. Newspapers that had praised the Fairchild fortune now hinted at scandal. Even the parish records, those most sacred keepers of fact, recorded her not as grieving widow, but as a woman of fragile constitution. The ledger remained her only anchor, though she understood that its possession was dangerous. She had seen the hunger in Kensington's eyes, the veiled threats in Cromwell's, and the silence of Wright, which was perhaps the most terrifying of all. Her husband's death was no solitary misfortune. It was the beginning of an erasure she now feared might end with her name consigned not to history, but to the medical files of Dr. Henley. Tonight we follow Eleanor Fairchild deeper into the labyrinth, a widow now marked, not only as inconvenient, but as unstable. In the Gilded Age, a woman's voice could be silenced not with chains, but with prescriptions and polite phrases. If you believe history is always written by the victors, then listen closely, because here, history was stolen by the doctor's hand tightens. Dr. Peeville Henley no longer asked Eleanor if she grieved. He asked if she dreamed of Theodore's return, if she heard whispers at night, if she felt the walls moving closer around her bed. When she answered honestly that yes, she dreamt of Theodore, that yes, the house creaked like it concealed secrets. He smiled gently and wrote in his ledger, "Paranoia deepening, recommend observation." Eleanor began to dread his visits more than the partner. At least Kensington and Cromwell made their hunger plain. Henley cloaked his incompassion. His prescriptions multiplied, tonics that dulled her thoughts, powders that left her numb until sunrise, restoratives that blurred the lines between waking and night. Servants, following his orders, locked away her correspondence. Visitors were turned away with polite refusals. Eleanor Fairchild, widow of a man once considered a pillar of New York society, was being gently erased. The ledger becomes a weapon, yet she clung to the forbidden book. At night, when the house fell silent, Eleanor took her husband's ledgers and compared them against newspaper announcements and public records. She discovered patterns of convenience: a factory fire in Lawrence, Massachusetts, coinciding with large shipments to Wright's Mill; a ship declared lost at sea, yet its cargo listed as received by Cromwell's shipping house; sudden changes in the charitable foundations of Kensington, matching bribes disguised as donations. The more she read, the more the pieces fell into place. This was not business. It was murder, extortion, and the careful orchestration of controlled disasters. She began her own notes in the margins, underlining passages with quivering hands. If these men are untouchable, then so too is the system that protects the doctors, the lawyers, the ministers. They stand together. If I fall, let this book speak for me. Whispers in the household. It was not only Henley and the partners who pressed upon her. Eleanor noticed changes in her staff. Servants who had been with the family for years now carried unfamiliar tones in their voices. Conversations ended when she entered a room. Letters she had written were never sent, though she watched them sealed. Once, in the pantry, she overheard two maids whispering, "They say she's not well. They'll put her away, you'll see." The words struck Eleanor with a chill colder than the marble floor. Already her reputation was being rewritten in absentia. The diagnosis. At last, Henley spoke plainly. One afternoon, he closed his notebook and adjusted his spectacles before declaring, "Mrs. Fairchild, I must recommend that you consider a course of treatment in a private facility. Your nerves are not improving. Your delusions are growing worse. Isolation and observation will do you good." Eleanor's protest, that she was not ill, that she had proof of conspiracy, that the ledgers themselves condemned these men, only served as further evidence for Henley. Paranoid fixation, he muttered, scribbling furiously, dangerous to her own stability. The word hysteria found its way into his report, and with it, the weight of the age's medicine turned against her. A secret resolve. But Eleanor, though weakened by the tonics and worn down by solitude, was not yet defeated. She smuggled scraps of her writings into hidden crevices, behind the loose panel in the floorboards, inside the hollow of a clock long since broken. Each note bore not only her suspicions, but names, dates and figures, evidence she prayed someone someday might uncover. Her hand shook as she wrote, but her words carried a clarity sharper than any tonic could dull. "They think me mad, but madness is their invention. If I am locked away, it is not my illness, but their fear of truth. Let whoever finds this know that I saw, I named, and I resist." The shadow of the sanitarium. Rumors of the Westchester private sanitarium reached her ears, a place where women of nervous disposition were sent to recover, though many never returned. The newspapers called it a haven of healing. Eleanor had begun to suspect it was a graveyard disguised as a hospital. She saw her future being written in real time. A widow, inconvenient, labeled mad,
her ledgers confiscated, her voice smothered, her fate signed into permanence by the same men who profited from her husband's death. The net tightens. By winter's first snow the plan was clear. The visitors came less frequently now, confident in Henley's work. The servants obeyed without question. The household felt less like home than a cave. Every hour, Eleanor fought to remain lucid, to hold to her evidence, to resist the narrative being constructed around her. She understood that history would not remember her warnings, unless she carved them deep enough into the cracks of time to survive the fire they planned to set over her truth. By now, Eleanor Fairchild understood that she was not merely widowed, she was condemned. The powerful men who had destroyed her husband had turned their gaze upon her, not to kill her swiftly, but to erase her voice, her memory, and her very sanity.
The shrinking house, the Fairchild home, once alive with guests and laughter, had grown silent. Curtains stayed drawn, doors locked, clocks muffled. The sound of her own footsteps seemed foreign in rooms where Theodore's presence lingered, like a ghost. Servants she had once trusted no longer looked her in the eye. When Eleanor asked after her letters, they claimed they had been sent, yet no replies ever came. She knew the truth. Her words never left these walls. Her meals arrived late, laced with the bitter taste of Henley's powders. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams sharp with fragments of Theodore's voice, warning her, "Do not trust them. They will bury you in silence." The ledger speaks louder. Eleanor clung to her discoveries with a desperation bordering on the sacred. The ledger was not simply a book now. It was a testament, her only ally. She copied passages by candlelight, scribbling dates and names into folded scraps that she hid in places no physician would think to look. Beneath the lining of her trunk, inside the hollow leg of a writing desk, even within the seam of her morning dress, one entry chilled her most, a notation of removal beside the name of a shipping competitor who had died suddenly in his sleep. Another, a payment to an unnamed specialist, the sum large enough to purchase a mansion outright. It was clear Henley had been in their service long before Theodore's death. The visit, late one afternoon, Kensington himself arrived. His appearance in her home was unexpected, his manner polished but edged with cruelty. "Miss Fairchild," he said smoothly, seating himself without invitation, "your condition is of concern to all who admired your husband. You are unwell. You must accept treatment for your own dignity and for Theodore's memory." Eleanor forced herself upright, her voice trembling but sharp. "My husband was not ill. He was murdered. And your hands are stained with it." Kensington's expression did not falter. If anything, his smile deepened. "You see, Dr. Henley is right. The paranoia worsened." He stood, adjusted his coat, and with a nod to the butler, departed. The finality of it struck Eleanor like a blow. Her words had not wounded him. They had only confirmed his plan. The whispered warnings. That night, one of the younger maids slipped into her chamber, eyes darting to the hall before she whispered, "They'll take you soon, ma'am. To Westchester. Best you prepare." Then, just as quickly, the girl fled, leaving Eleanor in darkness with the weight of confirmation. The sanitarium, the place from which women rarely returned. She had heard stories, rest cures that bled the will away, treatments that resembled torture more than medicine, and the silence. No letters, no voices, no proof. If she were taken there, the ledger would vanish, her truth would vanish. The plan to resist, her resolve hardened. Eleanor began drafting a final testament, not of wealth, but of truth. She wrote with feverish intensity, scrawling a narrative of Theodore's death, of Cromwell's ships, Wright's mills, Kensington's donations, and Henley's poisons. She signed each page with her full name, as if daring history to erase her hand. Each copy she hid separately, one behind a loose brick in the hearth, another wrapped in oilcloth, and buried beneath the garden's winter earth. She prayed at least one would survive when the rest of her was taken. The breaking point. Henley arrived again, this time with attendants. They stood tall and silent, their uniforms plain but unmistakable, orderlies of Westchester, sanitarium. "Mrs. Fairchild," Henley intoned, "it is time, for your health, for your safety." Eleanor clutched the ledger to her chest. For my silence, you mean? The orderlies moved closer. She backed against the wall, her breath ragged, her body frail but her voice rising with a final desperate fury. Theodore was murdered. Kensington, Cromwell, right. You will not bury me without my words being found. The struggle was brief. They pried the book from her hands, her nails tearing the leather as if to carve her resistance into its cover. Henley, calm as ever, tucked it beneath his arm. Paranoia complete, he murmured. She will be safest under watch. The departure. Through the frost-glazed window of her carriage, Eleanor watched her home disappear into the blur of winter trees. She wondered which hiding place would endure, if the hearth brick would be discovered, if the buried oilcloth would rot, if the clock's hollow belly would be searched. Her heart clung to a fragile hope that some trace would remain, some evidence would whisper her truth to a future that might listen. As the carriage wheels carried her toward Westchester's looming gates, she pressed her trembling hand to the glass and whispered Theodore's name. The walls of her life had closed in. The sanitarium was her cage now. Westchester did not look like a prison. Its facade was a whitewashed mansion, its lawns carefully trimmed, its windows glinting with the promise of care. But Eleanor Fairchild knew the truth. It was a tomb for the living. The arrival. The gates creaked open, iron teeth swallowing her carriage. The sanitarium rose ahead, a sprawling estate meant to soothe wealthy patrons with the illusion of gentility. Orderlies in stiff uniforms flanked the steps, their faces expressionless as stone. Henley guided her inside. The air smelled of lavender and carbolic acid, a mask over the sharper scent of despair. Portraits of benefactors lined the halls, men with stern gazes, women whose eyes had been painted to suggest serenity. But behind the walls, Eleanor could already hear it. Muffled cries, rattling chains, a low moan that seeped beneath the doors. The rules of silence. She was stripped of her mourning dress and given a pale linen gown, thin as paper. Her personal belongings were confiscated. Every pin, every scrap of paper, every trace of the ledger. The matron, a severe woman with a smile carved too thin, recited the rules. No correspondence without inspection, no unsupervised walks, no talking after sundown, no writing unless permitted. Any violation would result in treatment. Eleanor felt the noose tighten. They had not brought her here to heal. They had brought her here to disappear. The treatments, days dissolved into a cycle of cures designed to break rather than mend. First came the rest cure. Confined to her bed for hours, forbidden to read or speak, ordered to stare at the ceiling until her thoughts dissolved. Nurses fed her spoonfuls of heavy tonics, their metallic taste numbing her tongue. Then came the water therapies, plunges into icy baths, her body racked with shivers until her lips turned blue. She was told it would calm her nerves. Most dreaded of all were Henley's private sessions. He spoke to her softly, coaxingly, as though she were a child. Miss Fairchild, you must stop clinging to these delusions. Your husband's death was a tragedy, nothing more. To accuse men of such stature, do you see how it proves your instability? But Eleanor's silence was her defiance. She would not give him the satisfaction of confession. The other women. At night, when orderlies dozed in their chairs, Eleanor whispered to the other women hidden in neighboring rooms. One had been placed here by a husband eager to inherit her fortune. Another had spoken too freely of a senator's indiscretions. A third had simply refused to marry. All were branded hysterics, their voices silenced by the authority of doctors and signatures of men. Eleanor realized she was not alone, but she was also not unique. She was part of a pattern, a machinery of erasure. The hidden pages, though they had taken her belongings, Eleanor found ways to write. She begged scraps of paper from sympathetic maids, used charcoal smuggled from the stove, and scribbled fragments of her testimony in the margins of old newspapers. She hid them beneath the mattress, behind loose floorboards, inside hollowed-out soap cakes. Each word was a spark against the encroaching dark. Sometimes she wrote Theodore's name again and again, as if by repetition she could summon his spirit to guard her. Henley's triumph. Weeks passed. Eleanor's body weakened. Her hair, once carefully arranged, now hung in tangled strands. The tonics clouded her mind. The treatments drained her strength. Henley noted her decline in his ledger with satisfaction. Patient displays progressive detachment from reality. Episodes of mutism. Hallucinations of deceased husband. Prognosis incurable. To him, this was victory.
A woman destroyed was a woman silenced. Eleanor's resistance, yet still, a flame burned. When Henley leaned close, she whispered just once, so softly it chilled him. They will find the ledger. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. For the first time Henley's composure wavered, his jaw tightened, his eyes flickered. Then, just as swiftly, the mask returned. Delusions, he murmured, we will cure them. But he knew what she meant. Somewhere outside these walls, fragments of her truth still lay hidden. The vanishing winter deepened. Snow buried the sanitarium grounds, muting all sound. Eleanor's presence grew fainter each day, until even the other patients spoke of her as though she were already gone. On a bleak February morning, her bed was found empty. The staff spoke of a sudden collapse, a frail body unable to withstand the strain of her condition. There was no autopsy, no funeral, just a line in Henley's records: Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, deceased. Her name would never appear in the ledgers of history, only in the whispered margins of forgotten tragedies, the shadow of legacy. Yet the story did not end with her death. Though Henley claimed her silence as proof of madness, the hidden scraps she left behind, the whispers shared among maids and patients, and the suspicions carried by those who had seen too much ensured that her ghost lingered. Westchester had swallowed her, but it could not fully bury her truth. Somewhere, under stone and soil, her warning still waited to be unearthed. Eleanor Fairchild's absence was not a tragedy to the men who put her there. It was a convenience. Henley's ascent. Dr. Peeville Henley emerged from the Fairchild case, with his reputation burnished, not tarnished. Whispers of Eleanor's instability had been carefully fed into the right circles. Society papers described her as a woman undone by grief, fragile and prone to delusion. Henley, meanwhile, was lauded as a man of rare sensitivity and skill, unafraid to confront the shadowy ailments of the female mind. His practice grew overnight. Carriages belonging to wealthy families now lined the street outside his private office. Wives, daughters, sisters, all were brought to him with trembling hands and whispered confessions. Anxiety, melancholy, paranoia. The cure was always the same: Westchester, the sanitarium's purpose. On paper, the Westchester Private Sanitarium was a place of healing. In reality, it was a discreet vault for society's problems. A mistress who threatened exposure, a widow who refused to sell her land, an heiress who wished to marry beneath her station, a woman who knew too much. All were received behind its iron gates, branded hysterical, and quietly arrayed. The sanitarium flourished because it provided a service no court or jail could: permanent silencing without scandal, the treatments that killed. Henley's success rate was remarkable, but his patients died with unsettling frequency. He attributed it to the severity of their nervous disorders, an unavoidable consequence of fragile constitutions. In truth, the treatments hastened death. Ice baths shocked the body into collapse. Tonics laced with narcotics dulled organs until they ceased to function. Isolation induced breakdowns that ended in quiet suicides. Every death was documented in clinical language, every body buried quickly, without inquiry. To the public, Henley was a healer. To his benefactors, he was an executioner, in a white coat. The fire that cleansed. For 15 years Westchester remained an open secret, a place whispered about in drawing rooms, never named in newspapers. Then, in 1902, a fire swept through the sanitarium's records room. Flames devoured admissions ledgers, patient files, and correspondence. Henley called it a tragic accident. Survivors whispered it was deliberate. What mattered was this: the proof of who had been sent there, and why, was gone forever. Eleanor Fairchild's name, along with hundreds of others, dissolved into the conspirators' legacy. By the early 1900s, the men Eleanor had sought to expose were old or gone. Harrison Kensington, Marcus Cromwell, James Wright, each was celebrated at his passing, his obituaries recounting contributions to industry, philanthropy, and the progress of the American nation. Not a word was spoken of the blood that paved their rise. Their fortunes endured, invested in shipping lanes, textile mills, railroads and banks. Their descendants inherited wealth, cleansed of its origin, monuments raised to celebrate their generosity. Yet their darker legacy remained: violence disguised as business, justice bent by money, medicine twisted into a weapon. The methods Eleanor had glimpsed did not die with them. They became templates for the criminal empires of the new century. Eleanor's vanishing. Eleanor's story dissolved into obscurity. Academic studies of hysteria occasionally mentioned her as a patient at Westchester, but never as a witness silenced for her knowledge. Her warnings, her scraps of testimony, the words she carved in desperation, all remained scattered, buried, or destroyed. No history book recorded her bravery, no monument bore her name. She became what her enemies had intended, a cautionary tale of female madness, a ghost stripped of identity. The real horror, Eleanor Fairchild's tragedy, reveals something far more chilling than any spectre, that the most monstrous acts are committed, not by demons or beasts, but by men who believe wealth places them above consequence. Her life is a reminder of how easily power can corrupt institutions meant to heal and protect, transforming them into prisons and graves. And yet, though she vanished, her shadow lingered. Every time history uncovers a woman silenced by the label of hysteria, every time a sanitarium's records reveal more than treatment, Eleanor's ghost stirs. She is proof that truth, though buried, is never entirely destroyed. History does not remember Eleanor Fairchild, but silence is not the same as absence. The vanishing of a name. By the dawn of the 20th century, Eleanor Fairchild was no longer a person, she was a diagnosis. Her admission file at Westchester listed her not as witness, wife or widow, but as patient 47, hysteria, complicated by paranoia. Her family name was stripped of dignity and reduced to shorthand for madness. After the fire of 1902, even that paper trail turned to smoke. Without records, without testimony, Eleanor's existence was relegated to whispers and fading memory. She became precisely what her enemies intended her to be, forgotten. The men who buried her, the architects of her downfall, passed into marble and stone. Harrison Kensington, the magnate whose philanthropy built hospitals, was buried beneath an angel whose wings stretched toward heaven. Visitors left flowers for the man who gave so much. Marcus Cromwell's empire of ships carried goods across oceans. His family crest, carved into the bow of vessels that sailed beneath the American flag. James Wright's textile mills clothed thousands, his name etched into granite as a pioneer of industry. Each man received praise, honor, and reverence. Their obituaries lauded them as visionaries. Their darker histories lay beneath the soil, untouched and unspoken. They were remembered for building America. No one remembered the graves they built along the way.
A legacy of shadows. What Eleanor tried to stop did not end with their deaths. The methods those men perfected became blueprints for others. Business rivals vanished under mysterious circumstances. Politicians were blackmailed into silence. Doctors continued to weaponize their diagnoses against women who resisted the structures around them. The very concept of female hysteria endured well into the 20th century, justifying countless incarcerations of women whose only crime was disobedience. Sanitariums became cages where inconvenient voices were muffled under the guise of medicine. Eleanor was not the first to be trapped there, and she was far from the last. The forgotten witness. In dusty archives, a few scraps of Eleanor's voice sometimes surfaced. A fragment of a letter tucked into an unrelated file, a marginal note copied by an unknown clerk. In these fragments she does not sound mad, she sounds terrified. She writes of men who dined together in private rooms, their laughter too loud for innocence, of ledgers filled with names and payments, of ship manifests that carried more than cargo. She writes of patterns of disappearances, of widows silenced, and she writes of the sanitarium, warning that it was no hospital but a tomb for the living. Her words, scattered and incomplete, cannot convict anyone, yet they reveal a woman who was not delusional but perceptive, a woman who saw too much. The silence of history. The Gilded Age shines in textbooks as an era of wealth, invention, and progress. Railroads stitched the nation together. Factories roared with productivity. Millionaires built palaces along Fifth Avenue. But in the cracks of that glittering facade lie the bodies of the silent. Eleanor's story is one among thousands servants whose deaths were dismissed. Women institutionalized for speaking too loudly. Workers buried in unmarked graves beneath factories. Official history rarely records them. Power dictates what is remembered. Wealth shapes the story. Eleanor Fairchild did not have wealth. She had only her testimony, and testimony is fragile when spoken against men who own newspapers, judges, and doctors. The real monsters. The most chilling truth of Eleanor's tragedy is this: there were no ghosts, no demons, no curses. There were only men who believed their fortunes excused their crimes, men who used charity to cleanse their reputations, men who turned hospitals into graves, and medicine into murder. The supernatural terrifies because it is unknown, but Eleanor's story reminds us that the ordinary can be far more horrifying. A monster with fangs may be defeated. A man in a fine suit, shaking your hand with practiced warmth, that is a terror more enduring. Eleanor's shadow. Though her body lies in an unmarked grave, Eleanor's shadow lingers in every whisper of corruption, every story of silenced women. Her tragedy warns us that wealth, when left unchecked, reshapes justice into a weapon. It reminds us that institutions meant to heal can be corrupted into tools of oppression, and it teaches us that courage often comes at the highest cost. For Eleanor did not go quietly. She wrote, she resisted, she tried to carry the truth to light, she risked everything. And though she was erased, the attempt itself matters. It matters because in the margins of history, sometimes a ghost is in the closing of the tale. So when we look back at Eleanor Fairchild's story, we see not just the tragedy of a woman crushed by conspiracies, but a mirror held to our own time. How many truths remain buried because those who speak them lack the power to be heard? How many voices are dismissed as unstable, inconvenient, hysterical? Eleanor's fate may be sealed, her evidence lost, but her lesson survives, that the most terrifying monsters are not specters lurking in the dark, but ordinary men who convince themselves that laws bend for them alone. That is the horror that endures. And so the tale of Eleanor Fairchild ends, not with justice, but with silence. A silence heavy enough to last centuries. What is forgotten is never truly gone. It waits, it lingers, and sometimes it whispers through the cracks of time. The dust of memory. Decades have passed since Eleanor Fairchild's name dissolved into silence. The sanitarium is long gone, reduced to ashes and weeds. The families of her enemies thrive, their descendants walking in wealth, their surnames engraved on universities, libraries, and museums. To the casual visitor there is no trace of Eleanor, no grave, no monument, no plaque. Yet history, like the earth itself, refuses to fully bury what it swallowed. On nights when the fog rolls in across Westchester, old locals say you can hear the faint rattle of chains and the echo of a woman's voice calling through the trees. Listen, listen to me. The fire that hid the truth, the fire of 1902, did more than consume paper. It devoured accountability. Witnesses who might have spoken were gone. Records that might have implicated powerful men turned to ash, and yet scattered testimonies still surface like fragments of bone after rain. One clerk later confessed that not all the files were destroyed. A few were stolen before the flames took hold. Smuggled out in satchels, they disappeared into private collections, traded like currency among men who understood their worth. What secrets lay in those papers? Names, ledgers, payment trails. We may never know, but their absence is louder than their presence. The blood in the foundation. Eleanor's story is not an isolated tale. It is a window into a pattern repeated again and again. Workers who vanished after threatening strikes. Women consigned to institutions after accusing men of violence. Doctors who wrote diagnoses that served patrons instead of patients. Judges whose gavels protected gold, not truth. Every empire has its hidden graveyard. The Gilded Age simply built its monuments taller, casting longer shadows across the bodies beneath. The skyscrapers, the universities, the shipping lines, many still standing today, owe their strength not only to labor but to silence. Eleanor's voice then and now. A researcher once stumbled across a faded journal in an estate sale, its leather warped with age. Inside were notes written in a woman's hand, sharp, deliberate, desperate. They matched Eleanor's letters. She described rooms where men gathered to laugh over cigars while deciding which rivals would be ruined. She sketched floor plans of the sanitarium, noting the locked doors, the corridors that smelled of chloroform, and in one final entry she wrote, "If these words are found, remember me not as mad but as someone who saw the truth, and would not be silent." That journal now sits in a private archive, unseen by the public, whispered about by historians who argue whether it is authentic or a forgery. But those who have read it speak of a chill that lingers, as though the ink itself resists the comfort of disbelief. The price of forgetting. It is easy from the safe distance of the present to pity Eleanor and then move on, to fold her story into the endless catalogue of tragedies, but forgetting comes at a cost. Every time a powerful man is shielded by reputation, every time an inconvenient voice is dismissed as unstable, Eleanor's silence is repeated. Her tragedy reminds us that institutions we trust, medicine, law, charity, are not immune to corruption. They can be twisted, repurposed and used as weapons. The sanitarium was not a failure of medicine but its perversion, and while her enemies are dead, their methods are very much alive. The ghost of the Gilded Age. Legends cling to the ruins of Westchester Sanitarium. Some say the foundation stones are still buried in the earth, covered by weeds and moss. Children dare each other to visit, to press their ears to the ground and listen. Those who do claim to hear faint scratching, like fingernails on wood. Others say a woman in white wanders the grounds, her face pale, her mouth open in a scream that never ends. Whether ghost or memory, it does not matter. Every society is haunted by the voices it silences. Eleanor's haunting is simply more literal. Lessons in the dark. The question remains, why tell this story at all? Because Eleanor's tragedy is not about her alone. It is about what power does when it feels untouchable. It is about how history polishes the reputations of men, while erasing the women who defied. Her silence is not just hers. It belongs to every voice forced into the shadows, and perhaps in telling it, in refusing to let her vanish, we restore a fragment of what was taken from her. Closing the circle, Eleanor Fairchild will never be canonized in text. Her name will not stand beside those of Carnegie, Rockefeller or Vanderbilt. But perhaps she does not need marble or bronze. Perhaps her true monument is in the whispers that carry her story forward, the retellings, the warnings, the uneasy awareness that wealth and respectability can mask rot and ruin. And perhaps when we say her name now, we undo a fraction of the erasure. Eleanor Fairchild, not patient, not hysteric, not madwoman, a witness, a woman. The last question, so I leave you with this. Do you believe Eleanor's story is a relic of the past, an echo confined to the Gilded Age? Or do you think her shadow still walks among us, in boardrooms, in hospitals, in the polite laughter of powerful men? And if she still lingers, whispering from the margins of history, the question is not will we hear her, it is will we listen. The dead cannot speak, but sometimes paper remembers what men tried to burn. The unearthed box. In 1978, nearly 3/4 of a century after the sanitarium fire, a box was discovered in the attic of a condemned Westchester mansion. The house had once belonged to a junior partner of James Wright, the textile magnate. Its floors sagged, its windows were broken, but its attic remained sealed until demolition workers pried open the beams. Inside, beneath rotting quilts, they found a locked wooden box. The lock had rusted away, and when it was forced open, the workers discovered what looked like rubbish, charred scraps of paper, water-stained ledgers, and brittle envelopes tied with twine. But among them was a name, Eleanor Fairchild. The fragments, the box's contents were incomplete, half-burned, eaten by mold, but they told enough. Medical files bearing Eleanor's name, stamped, delusional, hysteria. The handwriting matched Dr. Pavel Henley's signature. Yet in the margins, another hand had scribbled questions, too coherent for hysteria. Why suppress? Correspondence between Cromwell's shipping offices and Kensington's legal clerks, noting arrangements for the woman and continued monitoring of Fairchild. Receipts for large sums paid to the sanitarium. No diagnosis, no treatment listed, only the note extended care, private wing. One fragment even hinted at the conspiracy Eleanor claimed to expose. If she continues to press, we will act in the manner discussed. Her removal must be permanent. Silence at any cost. Suppression. The box should have become a historical sensation, but it didn't. When the demolition workers passed it to a local historian, he submitted it to an archive for authentication. Within weeks, federal officials collected the box, claiming it contained sensitive property related to ongoing legal investigations. The historian never saw it again, and when he filed a Freedom of Information request years later, the reply was simple: no such materials are in possession of the United States government. Modern parallels. The disappearance of the Fairchild box mirrors her fate, erased, labeled mad, But why would a century-old scandal still warrant suppression? Perhaps because Eleanor's story was not a lone incident, but a template,
one repeated by families whose influence never ended. Even today, wealthy heirs fund the same hospitals, universities and courts that once silenced voices like hers. The names Kensington, Cromwell, and Wright may be gone, but their descendants sit on boards, their corporations alive under new names. The pattern Eleanor died to expose, wealth shielding crime, institutions bending to power, remains alive. The shadow of the sanitarium. In 2001, urban explorers searching for forgotten ruins claimed to find the buried foundation of the Westchester Sanitarium. What they reported chilled even skeptics. They described subterranean rooms, filled with rusted bed frames, leather restraints still bolted to walls, and scraps of medical charts scattered across the dirt. One claimed to have seen Eleanor's name, etched faintly into a stone wall, as though scratched there by fingernails. Their photographs circulated briefly online before being removed from major forums. Some dismissed the images as fabrication, but others, those who had researched the sanitarium, believed, a voice that refuses silence. Eleanor's story has survived not because official history preserved it, but because it refused to vanish. Her name surfaces in whispered local legends, in obscure medical journals, in half-burned ledgers and missing archives. Every reappearance feels like resistance. A woman who would not go quietly, who continues to claw her way back into memory no matter how many times she is buried. And with each resurfacing, her warning grows louder. We are not safe simply because the men who harmed me are dead. Their methods live on. The question of curses. Some say the Fairchild box was cursed. 3 men who handled it reportedly died within a year of strange sudden illnesses. One fell down a stairwell. Another vanished on a hunting trip. The historian who first reported it died in a fire in his study. His notes on Eleanor reduced to ash. Skeptics laugh, but legends thrive in silence. If the box survives, perhaps Eleanor herself clings to it. Perhaps she has chosen it as her anchor, the last artifact that still bears her truth, the last echo. History insists Eleanor Fairchild was delusional, a woman overcome by nerves. But if the fragments are real, if the box was genuine, then she was never mad at all. She was right, and her erasure was not an accident, but an act of deliberate violence against truth itself. Even now in the digital age, her story flickers between exposure and erasure, uploaded, deleted, whispered, forgotten, retold, a cycle that mirrors her life, speaking, silenced, speaking again. The question is whether we will finally listen long enough to break the pattern.
Closing words. Eleanor Fairchild was not just a victim of the Gilded Age. She was a witness, a warning, a mirror. The sanitarium may be dust, the conspirators long buried, but the forces she fought, wealth without accountability, institutions twisted against the vulnerable, remain. And so, as long as those forces thrive, so will Eleanor's shadow. Her name is not gone. It waits. It lingers. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you may hear it whispering back through the cracks of history. Remember me. There are endings that never truly end, only histories that change their form. Eleanor's silence was not the last word, merely the first breath of something waiting. The closing archive. The last recorded mention of Eleanor Fairchild appears in an inventory list of unclaimed remains dated March 9. Her body was never delivered to kin, never placed in a family plot. Instead, a note in a county ledger reads only disposed, medical instruction. No grave, no stone, no prayer, and yet her presence persists. The archivist's burden. In 2015, while cataloging the back holdings of the New York State Medical Society, I discovered an unlabeled folio bound in cracked leather. Its pages smelled of mildew and ether. No cover page, no author's name, but inside charts, copied letters and transcriptions of interviews with sanitarium staff. Stamped in red ink across the inner flap were the words, Proframp of Wright Institute, not for circulation. Among its brittle sheets lay a passage that froze me. Fairchild persists in noting details with extraordinary precision. Her claims are coherent, but the effect is dangerous. Patients who overhear her become restless. Orderlies instructed to monitor her writings and destroy when possible. So much effort, just to erase a woman branded insane. The return of her words. Tucked in the folio was something stranger still, a folded sheet in handwriting unlike the medical clerk. It bore the tremor of fear, the pressure of someone writing quickly by candlelight. If this reaches beyond the walls, know that I was of sound mind. I saw what they did, and knew the truth they buried. They feared not my madness but my clarity. Remember my name. Do not let them make me vanish. The signature, half faded, was hers. E. Fairchild, haunting the present. Since handling that folio, I have not slept undisturbed. At night I sometimes hear the faint scratching of a pen across paper. At first I blamed neighbors. Later I moved houses entirely, but the sound followed. I have come to wonder, is Eleanor's plea, remember my name, a command that binds its reader? Others who have touched these papers claim the same. Voices that whisper, shadows that pause at the periphery, mirrors that reflect a second figure in the room. Skepticism is easy in daylight. It is harder at 3 in the morning when your breath fogs in a warm room. The pattern continues, even outside her name. The pattern Eleanor described continues into the present. Whistleblowers silenced as unstable, victims of exploitation dismissed as delusion, families of power pressing their weight upon courts, doctors and press alike. The vocabulary has shifted, but the design remains unchanged. It was never about Eleanor alone. She was a prototype, a rehearsal for countless others. The sanitarium grounds today. Developers finally purchased the sanitarium grounds in 2019, planning condominiums, but workers reported unease, sudden headaches, falling tools, machinery refusing to start when parked atop the old foundation. One laborer swore he heard a woman's voice beneath the soil crying, "Not mad, not mad." The project halted within the year. The land remains untouched, officially due to funding disputes. Unofficially, the crew will not return. A living curse. Curses do not linger in bloodlines alone. They dwell in memory. They attach to names, to injustices unanswered, to truths left rotting in silence. Eleanor Fairchild has become such a curse, a presence refusing to be forgotten, pressing back against the erasure that consumed her. And if you are hearing this now, her curse has reached you as well. So we close this tale, but listen closely, because the silence that follows is never empty. Within it breathes the voice of a woman branded insane, locked away, erased from her time. A voice that still whispers through scorched ledgers, through missing folios, through the cracks in history itself. Remember me, remember what they did, for it was never only me. It is still happening. Do not mistake this as a ghost story. It is an inheritance, an unbroken chain of secrecy, silence, and rot. The names may change, the methods may modernize, but the pattern lives, and so does Eleanor Fairchild.